Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day and welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's The View from the Senate Advocacy Anywhere program is brought to you in partnership with AJC Westchester Fairfield. The View from the Senate series features exclusive conversations with Republican and Democratic senators from across the country to discuss issues of mutual concern. And today, we are delighted to be joined by United States Senator Chris Murphy, the junior senator from Connecticut, for a timely conversation on the U.S. Israel relationship, rising anti-Semitism around the world, the threat posed by Iran and other malign actors, and America's leadership on the global stage. Moderating today's conversation will be Julie Raymond, AJC Deputy Director for Policy and Diplomatic Affairs. As a reminder to our viewers, AJC is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization, and as such, AJC does not endorse or oppose political parties or candidates. After we hear from Julie and our esteemed guest, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org. That's questions plural. And with that, I now turn the floor over to you, Julie.
Thanks so much, Daniel, and thank you, Senator, for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
As we're looking towards January, the start of a new Senate and an incoming administration, I can think of no one better to outline some foreign policy expectations on key issues of importance to AJC and the Jewish community. I know your time is short, so we'll go right ahead. In his victory speech on Saturday night, President-elect Biden pledged to make America respected again around the world. If you were guiding him in the best first steps to tackle this challenge, what would you suggest? And might I add, are you in fact guiding him about the best first steps to tackle this challenge?
Well, Julia, I'm really excited and honored to join you here today. As you mentioned, our time may be a little bit shorter than we would have liked. We have a vote scheduled on the floor at noon, and so while I can stay a little bit past noon, I will have to get down for that vote. And let me thank AJC for everything that you have done to strengthen the U.S. Israel relationship, to educate members of Congress on the importance of the relationship. I've relied on you in Connecticut and here in D.C. During my tenure in the Senate and the House of Representatives. The short answer to your sort of last question is no, I'm not guiding the Biden administration. I certainly am humbled to be on some of these lists of those being considered for cabinet positions. And I stand ready to serve in any way that I can. But I don't necessarily think the president-elect needs a lot of advice as to how to begin to rebuild our reputation around the world. He has to start at home. So long as we have a coronavirus epidemic that continues to rage out of control as we speed towards 250,000 Americans that have died, there is no way for us to be able to regain our reputation or our credibility around the world. We are the sick child today. Our business people and our diplomats can barely even travel to other countries, never mind lead global conversations. And so we need to beat this virus. We need to rebuild our economy. And in doing so, we will be able to once again be in a position of leadership. And I think it's always important to remember that domestic policy is so intimately tied to America's ability to lead. The ill health of our democracy here is also a foreign policy issue. The inability of our country to be able to engage in a transition from one administration to the next, that weakens us globally as well. So I do hope that President-elect Biden will prioritize COVID response, prioritize rebuilding the economy, but also prioritize rebuilding our democracy, building back up our commitment to everybody being able to vote in this country, counting all the votes. If we do that, I think, frankly, it puts us in a better position to go around the world and talk about our values if we're actually living them at home. But when you turn to the sort of practice of foreign policy, it's certainly a long list, but alliances are key. They're broken, they're damaged, and well, our allies eagerly await a Biden administration, it will take some work in order to re-engage with Europe, in order to recommit ourselves to NATO. President-elect Biden will have to spend an enormous amount of time in Asia, rebuilding our bilateral relationships with Korea and trying to figure out a path forward with China that isn't so hyper-focused on trade. And in the Middle East, the president can start with reaffirming our sacred alliance with Israel. It may be that Vice President Biden will take a slightly different tack than Donald Trump did, but everything in that region should flow from our priority above and beyond all other priorities to make sure that Israel remains safe and sovereign and protected. And we can talk over the course of this call about what should the Biden administration be considering regarding the future of Israeli and Palestinian talks, the path forward with Iran, the opportunity that now exists with Gulf states that are recognizing Israel. But there's no place to start other than that commitment to the U.S. Israel relationship.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so let's dive into some of those issues. You've spoken about sort of the historic nature of the normalizing relationships between Israel and the UAE and others, and have expressed hope that these Abraham Accords may in fact mark the beginning of a new era in relations. Some are worried that the march towards normalization might stop or change as there's a new administration, either out of this impulse to simply break with the current administration, which is something normal and something we see regularly, or because this approach to the entire region may be so drastically different under a Biden administration. Can you speak to this? What would you expect?
Well, to the extent that many of the questions we're going to be discussing involves guessing or previewing a Biden administration's foreign policy, forgive me if I'm reluctant to do so. I can speak to, what my beliefs are about how the United States should engage with the world, but I think I'd probably be doing a disservice to the president-elect to be guessing as to how he's going to make decisions. So let me just reiterate what you said at the outset, that these are historic agreements. They are opportunities to reset the Middle East and to provide an unprecedented level of protection for Israel. What's interesting is that, back in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a lot of consternation about arms sales to GCC nations like Saudi Arabia because of the belief that those weapons could ultimately be used against Israel. That seems an antiquated notion today. We really can't conceive of weapons in the hands of the UAE or Qatar or Saudi Arabia being used against Israel. At the same time, my caution as we sort of foresee this new arrangement in the Middle East is that I don't believe that that the Abraham Accords or any other agreement by which a nation in the Middle East recognizes Israel should obligate the United States to sell weapons into the region that are ultimately going to make the United States and our interests less secure. And so I don't know what all of the agreements were between the Trump administration and, for instance, the UAE. I do know that there is a massive arms sale to the UAE that has been noticed to Congress. And I do not believe that it's in the best interest of the nation to force that sale through prior to the swearing in of Joe Biden. But I also think that we need to really sit down and decide whether we are comfortable with that number and that level of lethality of arms being sold into the region, especially while there are a number of hot wars that exist throughout the region. So I just want to make sure that we try to separate these conversations. And while I will work my tail off to try to get more nations to recognize Israel, to establish relations with them. I worry about that being dependent upon arms sale policy, because we might come to regret loading up the region with arms sales.
Very valid points. Thank you so much. Talking about your perspective on these issues, you probably remember that AJC went through a very rigorous process before we decided to oppose the JCPOA. From your perspective, how can we best now, because times have changed, the U.S. is no longer a party to the JCPOA, how can we best prevent Iran's nuclear capabilities? How do we interface with our European allies, Russia, China, others, if we intend to return to JCPOA and try to revise it? And do you think the Senate will play more of a role this time?
Oh, I think it'll be very difficult to return to the JCPOA. I think it'll be very difficult to return to the kind of alliance structure that we have built in order to negotiate the JCPOA. Remember, as much as we talk about the JCPOA being a U.S.-Europe led agreement, Russia and China were parties as well. It's kind of wild to think that the Obama administration was able to unite the United States, Europe, including Britain, China, and Russia around an Iran strategy. It may be that Donald Trump has blown up that alliance structure so completely that it cannot be put back together, which is one of the reasons why many of us were very strongly behind the JCPOA. We saw that as a unique opportunity to cement the US, China, Russia, and Europe on an Iran policy that then could be built upon, right? Our contention was that you move forward with the JCPOA, understanding that it did not cover the panoply of issues that concern us regarding Iran's behavior. But then once you have all these nations working together on nuclear policy, you then can build upon that to work on stopping Iran's financing of terrorist groups, their ballistic missile program. The problem is now that we've shattered that alliance structure, and now that the Trump administration also helped usher Britain out of the EU, it's very hard to put back together. And this maximum pressure campaign, which has done nothing except for move Iran's breakout time from 12 months to 3 months, has also changed politics inside Iran. Iran's going to have a presidential election next year, and they are likely going to elect hardliners that are not going to have any interest in negotiating with the United States, are going to be very interested in speeding forward Iran's nuclear research program and perhaps a nuclear weapons program. So color me skeptical that we will be able to re-enter that agreement, having broken from it, but we should give it a try. We should give it a try because it, again, I believe, is the way in which and the route through which you ultimately put together a coalition that then can be used to confront other malign behaviors of Iran in the region.
When the United States pulled out of the JCPOA, AJC, despite having opposed the deal at the onset, expressed a great deal of concern about what withdrawal would mean, especially as it relates to our alliances in Europe. In 2014, you came to AJC's Global Forum and you spoke on a panel with AJC's Berlin director and a German member of parliament about transatlantic relationships, about specifically at that time, Germany's increasingly important international role. Now, fast forward 6 years, we're in a very different geopolitical environment. What would you say about sort of the state of the transatlantic alliance and the role of major players like Germany, France, the UK, others?
Well, those nations are all very eager for a Biden administration. Obviously, you've seen these bilateral calls occur even outside of a formal transition. And so, it will not be impossible to rebuild our alliance structure, both bilaterally with nations in Europe, but also with the EU and with NATO. But I don't think that we should underestimate the permanent damage that's been done to America's ability to lead and to those structures during the Trump administration. Britain left the EU cheer-led by the Trump administration. That makes the EU much weaker. It makes it much harder for the US to advance our interests with the EU without Britain there. Remember, Britain was often carrying our water in conversations at the EU, both on national security issues, but also on economic issues. Now that Britain won't be at the table, it's going to create more friction points between the United States and the European Union. So there is some permanent damage that's been done there. Well, we have had a historic and important partnership with NATO in Afghanistan. The Trump administration's just disregard for our partners in Afghanistan, their decision to sort of go it alone on troop levels has chilled the interest of our allies to continue to work with us there. And that's going to be hard to put back together for Vice President Biden. At the same time, there are other places where it's not too late. Climate, for instance. Europe is going to welcome the United States back to the table on climate. There's going to be a COP summit in Europe in November of next year. And I think over the first 11 months of the Trump administration, we can absolutely work with our European partners to build up some agreements and some commitments that will be meaningful on climate. So I think there's damage done that can't be reversed. It's not too late to recommit ourselves to the alliance. And lastly, let me just say, with respect to the Middle East, really important for us to be together with the Europeans, and we have not been over the last 4 years. Our decisions in Syria, our decisions in Yemen were opposed by many European nations. Our decisions on refugees broke apart the United States from Europe, and so we have always benefited from, in as many cases as possible, staying on the same page with Europe on Middle East policy. And while that's not always possible, right, on Israel, we tend to take a very different position with respect to our belief in how those negotiations should go. It would be better for us to try to get back to the table, at least on other issues in the region.
For as tough as it is to remain on the same page with our European allies about Israel, it's even hard, I think, within Congress, within the Senate, and even within each party. For example, the conversation around annexation, you took a really tough stance in response to Israel's consideration of some form of annexation or extension of sovereignty. Of course, in the end, it didn't happen. But people like Senator Ben Cardin took a really different approach, as did Vice President Biden, actually. What are your reflections now that we're sort of looking in the rear view window on that scenario?
Well, I mean, I guess I would, maybe for the first time in our conversation today, I might object to the premise of the question. So, I'd encourage people to go and read the letter that Senator Kaine, Senator Van Hollen, and myself wrote, signed by about 18, 20 of our colleagues on this issue, and decide for yourself whether that letter actually represents a hard line. What we said in that letter is that it is not good for Israel nor the United States for Israel to unilaterally annex the West Bank or portions of the West Bank, and that our relationship has been dependent on some certainties, on some beliefs, one of which being that these kind of decisions, these major region-changing decisions, shouldn't be made without agreement of the parties and without real consensus. And so we said, listen, if you go forward with this, just know that it has the potential to harm and change the bilateral relationship. I don't necessarily know that that's a really outlandish thing to say or to suggest. And I'm glad that the decision was not made to move forward with the unilateral annexation or application of Israeli law to portions of the West Bank of the Jordan River Valley. But I sometimes do bristle a little bit at the characterization of some of our position on this as being a hard line. I think that most Democrats and many Republicans here would agree that it would not have been a good decision for Israel to do that. And I think by and large, that's what our letter was saying. Maybe we were just willing to say it out loud in a way that others here may not have been willing to say, but I don't know that it reflects a major difference of opinion between members of Congress.
Indeed, the way you just said it now didn't feel dissimilar to how AJC had spoken publicly and privately, actually, on that issue.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, Julie, I was frankly surprised that there were advocacy groups that were so opposed to our letter. We thought we had written it in a way that was more reflective of a consensus position. I think it's important to read the words on the page.
I also think that sometimes the partisanship plays into it as well, right? So perhaps people seeing it from a partisan group read into things differently. So I want to sort of stay on that topic, if you don't mind, and feel free to rebut the premise of my next question as well, as you feel like it's necessary. As we do in each election cycle, AJC provided platform suggestions to both the Democratic and Republican parties. And we're very pleased with the final language in the Democratic Party platform with regards to Israel. But of course, as we've seen in years past, this year was not different. There was a bit of contention, including a proposal calling for the conditioning of aid to Israel if annexation actually went through. Can you speak to the tension within the Democratic Party around Israel and maybe provide us some insight as to what we might see in the coming years?
Well, importantly, our letter did not call on the conditioning of U.S. aid to Israel. But I mean, let's be honest, you can certainly imagine a set of decisions made by any nation in the world that would in the aggregate be so antithetical to U.S. security interests that we would have to rethink our partnership. So while this bilateral relationship is different than all others, we do have to understand that at some point the same rules will apply. I am deeply worried about the politicization of the issue of Israel here in Congress. And I'll be very honest with you, while you may see divisions inside the Democratic Party poll U.S. senators here. There's near unanimity in the Democratic caucus in the United States Senate around the way in which we support the U.S. Israel relationship, but frankly have disagreements with the Netanyahu government and the ways in which we believe that they have steered the security of the region in directions that we may not support. I think that's okay. I think it's okay for Democrats to be steadfast supporters of the U.S. Israel relationship, but to have some disagreements with the current government. But I do really worry about the turn that is taken in this town to try to use Israel as a wedge, as a mechanism for political advantage. I'll take the Taylor Force Act as an example. That was a piece of legislation that in the end, Republicans and Democrats supported. It was introduced originally in a form that I will just tell you was deliberately intended to split the Democratic Party, because to many people, it just went a little bit too far in cutting off humanitarian aid to the Palestinian territories. And I'm just going to tell you, I was here for this whole thing. It was introduced in a way that was intended to make it look as if Democrats weren't supportive of this notion that we shouldn't be providing support to governments that provide harbor to terrorists. We were able to negotiate a version of that bill pretty easily that everybody supported. But the intention, I believe, was to make it political instead of saying, hey, let's at the beginning get a version of the bill that gets everybody's support. And I've expressed this concern to my leadership, but I will be honest, I have raised this issue directly with the Prime Minister. And I think he understands it. But I want to make sure that we do everything up front as we're sort of approaching all these issues to keep us together. And I think we can. There will always be elements of, frankly, both fringes of either side. There are unfortunately anti-Semitic fringes on both sides of the political spectrum. But if we do the work up front, we can maintain consensus here. I worry that sometimes we don't do that, and we haven't done that over the past few years, explicitly for the purpose of trying to divide one side or the other. And frankly, I think if Democrats took control of the Senate, we could try to do the same thing. I mean, we could write a piece of legislation on Israel that would touch a hot button for Republicans as a means of dividing them, right? But we're not going to do that. I hope we wouldn't do that, and that's what I hope Republicans will commit to as we, move forward in this next Congress.
Well, we certainly share that hope, and also the commitment to try to do as much work beforehand to avoid the splits that inevitably come up. You mentioned anti-Semitism and how that issue is also seen as sort of a wedge issue increasingly. This week marks the 81st anniversary of Kristallnacht, and you introduced a resolution in the Senate sort of acknowledging that anniversary. And first and foremost, I want to say on behalf of all of us at AJC, thank you for that. We just released a survey recently asking Americans about their opinions and their knowledge related to anti-Semitism, and found that just shy of a quarter of Americans admitted that they know either not much or nothing at all about the Holocaust. So initiatives like your resolution are vitally important to sort of keep that conversation at the forefront. All that being said, you're someone who follows this issue closely, issues related to Europe closely. What's the state of anti-Semitism in the world today from your perspective?
Well, it's deeply worrying. This epidemic of racist nationalism that is taking over in some countries in Europe, or is growing in many countries in Europe, is a threat to their security and a threat to Jews everywhere. We have seen a rapid growth of anti-Semitic activity and actions here in the United States. I unfortunately don't think that that necessarily reflects a growth in anti-Semitic belief. I think that there has been a sort of uncapping of the lid on a whole host of discriminatory behaviors and actions over the course of the last 4 years that has allowed for these individuals to feel that they have cover for their actions. But watching what's happening in Germany today with the just remarkable growth of this underground network of neo-Nazis that sort of has a less than thin veneer of connection to legitimate political groups like AfD, is really frightening. And it's going to be, I hope, a priority of the Biden administration to come up with a transatlantic strategy on anti-Semitism. A transatlantic strategy to fight this kind of neo-nationalism that has, frankly, won the day in some parts of Europe and threatens some of our most important partners like Germany. So, I'm going to be eager to be at that table and to be part of that healing work. But it can't just be talk. It's got to be action as well. And as you mentioned, teaching everywhere to every child about the history of the Holocaust, about the roots of anti-Semitism, really important.
Thank you. I have one more question, then we're going to turn to the audience. And I'm hoping that this will provide us with a little bit more hope. Talking about legislation that you've introduced, I want to ask you about your City and State Diplomacy Act. AJC's recently been trying to really deepen our ties with mayors and governors, not just around really important domestic issues around pluralism, things like that, but specifically also around foreign policy. What's your hope for this bill, and can we be helpful?
This is one of the more exciting endeavors that I've undertaken. And I will be honest, when this issue was brought to me, I think I at first, kind of snoozed a little bit on it. And the more I learned about it, and then the more that I, sort of got such enthusiastic support offered for it, the more I realized how important it could be. So here's the basic idea. We think of diplomacy as being nation-to-nation diplomacy, and that is still the most important kind of diplomacy. But in some ways, just as meaningful or more meaningful in terms of person-to-person connection is the subnational diplomacy, the diplomacy that can be done province to state, city to city, rural community to rural community, nonprofit organization to nonprofit organization. It is those kind of connections that can make the national level diplomacy a whole lot easier. And I have learned that over time. Exchange programs, for instance, are a wonderful way, especially with smaller nations, to build that connection to the United States. We used to have an office of subnational diplomacy at the State Department. It disappeared. This one I don't think was a fault of the Trump administration. This is just something that we stopped investing in, and we should start investing in it again. I remember during my first trip to Israel years ago, we actually spent an evening having dinner with municipal and business leaders of two small towns that were right on the Israel-PA border. Two towns that had become increasingly dependent on each other economically and politically, and sort of belied this sort of global reputation of constant conflicts between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, because here were these two small towns, these two mayors who said, no, we're dependent on each other, right? The Israeli population, the Jewish population here, dependent on the Arab population, the Palestinian population. And so that's a great example of how you can learn so much by being in rooms with leaders that are not just at the federal level. And I'm hopeful that this will be an initiative that the Biden administration will take up. It's certainly one that I'm going to push. And by the way, it's what our adversaries are investing in. So China does a ton of this subnational diplomacy. They send their local and provincial leaders all over the globe as a force multiplier to the work they're doing at the federal level. And we should do that too from a strategic standpoint, because we have so much to rebuild. We have so much work to do to regain our reputation in the world. The next Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense can't do it by themselves. They're going to need a lot of help.
Certainly. And in addition to that, so much to offer in terms of American values and expertise and all of that. So thank you. I'm glad we were able to touch on that. Daniel, do we have questions from the audience?
Sure. Thank you, Julie. And being mindful of the senator's time, we'll get to just a few of them. And I apologize for those that we don't get to. But our first question comes from AJC Westchester Fairfield President Stephanie Barron in Stamford, Connecticut, who asked, roughly a year ago, Senators Jackie Rosen and James Lankford started a Senate bipartisan task force for combating anti-Semitism. Is that something that you've considered joining with your Senate colleagues?
It's funny, there are many task force. I will not claim to be an active member of that task force. I may be a member of it, but I'll take a look at it. I'm not, admittedly, I'm not super familiar with their work, but I'm very close to Senator Lankford. He's one of my better friends in the Republican caucus. We actually do work together in the Middle East. He and I do a lot of work together on Lebanon, and Jackie and I are close. So I'm looking at the vote being open on the Senate floor. I'm going to be down on the floor talking to my colleagues in about 10 minutes. So I'll check in with them on that and be glad to join and become active in whatever activities they're engaged in. Sounds like a great project.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question comes from Mona Abramson, an AJC Westchester Fairfield lay leader, who asked, how do you see the new administration's policy towards the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically that partnership between Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, the Palestinian Authority?
Well, it is a real opportunity as we discover more natural resources in areas that require cooperation. It becomes an opportunity, and so I would say we haven't made as much progress there as we would have liked over the course of the last 4 years. But there are a number of other similar energy-related initiatives around the region in the Red Sea that provide the opportunity to use energy, hydro projects, water rights as a means to to bring countries together. Jordan and Israel, for instance, have several of those opportunities in front of them as well. So I hope that that's an area of partnership that the Biden administration can lead on.
Thank you. And I'll ask you one final question, since I know you have to leave, but this comes from Larry Beck, and we've been receiving a similar amount of questions from others as well that are asking just how can we make sure that support for Israel truly remains bipartisan?
Well, I appreciate that question. Listen, I think I talked a little bit already about one of the ways in which we can do this. I do not think we should reward efforts that are deliberate in their attempt to try to divide one party from itself. Again, the changes we made to the Taylor Force Act did not diminish the impact of the message we were sending. We just sort of looked at the language in that act and saw its potential to eliminate vast swaths of humanitarian aid that went to citizens. We felt like there was a way to keep the aid flowing to non-governmental organizations, even if we were going to cut off funding to the PA. And we were able to do that. But again, people may disagree with me, but I really do believe that the reason for the initial draft was to make it look like people like me were supportive of terrorists in the region because I didn't support that version of the act. It just didn't take that much work to get that to a product that we could ultimately support. And I do think that you have to understand the intersection of some of the things that were happening in Israel, some of the policies of the Netanyahu government, and how they were interpreted by people in this country in the context of the things Donald Trump is saying. So I think that when you have the president engaged in this overt war against Muslims, when you have him banning Muslims from coming to the country, suggesting that they are all terrorists, I do think that there are people in the Democratic Party who then are more skeptical of some of the things that Netanyahu is doing and saying about the risk to Israel presented by all Palestinians. So I think that this will become easier now that Joe Biden is president and that there is less of an overt anti sort of Muslim conversation happening in the United States. I think that some of these things, ultimately got conflated together. And so a lot of that, I think, maybe changes just by virtue of the administration changing. But I've just seen, I've seen a lot of ads on TV against my Democratic colleagues on the issue of Israel that really perverts their position. And I never saw that when I first got to Congress. I didn't see people sort of stretching the truth on the issue of support for Israel in order to win political points. There was for a long time a decision made by both parties to just sort of stand down on this issue politically and say, let's use all of our effort to try to bring people together instead of seeing it as a potential wedge issue that can be exploited politically. My hope is that can change. It has to change. It has to change because there's plenty to fight about in this town. We should not be engaged in open conflict, often with, I think, very damaging spin on each other's position regarding our support for Israel. We can have arguments or we can have discussions about the best way to support Israel, the best way to advance the U.S. Israel partnership. But we shouldn't be playing political games with the topic, as I think we have been doing over the course of the last 4 or 5 years.
Well, Senator, I hope you know from the course of this conversation and from your interactions with us in DC and in Westchester Fairfield that we are on the team of trying to bring people together around these important issues, trying to halt the divisiveness and create those nonpartisan, bipartisan policy solutions on Israel, on anti-Semitism, on issues related to pluralism that can bring us all together and advance our country and our nation's interests.
Can I just respond to that, Julie? Because I don't want my comments, I was asked a couple specific questions about this issue of what's happening inside the Democratic Party, and I gave you some very political answers because I don't think you can talk about this outside of the political context. But I want to make 100% clear that you are the solution here. AJC has a reputation in Washington and in communities across this country as being consensus builders, as being bridge builders when bridges need to be built, as being apolitical in the sense that you sort of keep your focus on the policy and on the mission. And so I am sort of diagnosing what I perceive to be the problem to you, because I know that you are going to be lined up to be part of the solution here, as you always have been. So I'm always deeply grateful for the partnership that we have, in part because you allow me to be candid in these conversations with you. You are equally candid back to me, and we are engaged. And I'm candid with you because I know that we're engaged in the same project, which is building a bipartisan support for the host of measures that we've talked about on this call.
With a compliment like that, you can interrupt me any day. With that, we'll let you go vote, talk to Senators Rosen and Langford about the bipartisan task force for combating anti-Semitism. We thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Everywhere. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you also to AJC's Westchester Fairfield Regional Office for making today's program possible. If you enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation to AJC at ajc.org/donate. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.